Oh, my mic wasn't on. Hello! Hi, I'm Gabe. Thank you for coming to another episode of Tabletop Tabletalk, which was a great tongue twister that I cursed myself with, and that's also a blessing. I have a fantastic guest with me here today. Jen, please, Jen, just introduce yourself, and then after you do, I'm going to brag about you too.
Oh no! Hi, I am Jen Kretchmer. I am the creator of the Accessibility and Gaming Resource Guide. I am an actor, producer, writer for TV and such. I do a bunch of streaming, and I am also one of the authors on Candlekeep Mysteries, which is D&D's newest hardcover.
Yes. So Jen does a lot. And people say I do a lot. So I feel like that makes me have permission to actively say it and mean it. Because Jem DMs, Jem does production, Jem does design, Jen does writing, Jen does consulting. That's like the whole hand right there. And we could just keep going. I've even seen you do costume stuff. I know that you help out with stage work and production, like in that sense. There's even like television experience.
Yeah, no, I've done over 1,000 episodes of television, mostly as a producer, also as an actor. Yeah.
What? Cool. All right. Not intimidated at all. But I know one of the biggest things that you focus on is advocacy in representation, especially for disability. And it's the kind of thing that I feel like we can bluntly say the representation and acknowledgement should be easy, and people make it obnoxious and difficult for probably no reason.
Yeah. Yes, they do.
And there's I'm gonna, this is not even tabletop related, but it's a media related thing. I was talking to someone yesterday, and I feel like people love How to Train Your Dragon, and completely ignore the fact that the main character Hiccup is considered disabled.
Yeah. I think How to Train Your Dragon is a really interesting one because in a lot of ways that's some of the really positive representation we've had for kids in terms of disability. There are definitely some complicated things about that narrative, but in a lot of ways it's a really great story. And a great opportunity to show kids disability where it's not shown as something scary, it's not shown as something sad, it's not shown as something that keeps people from living exciting, adventurous lives, and having families and enjoying everything they do. But it's so interesting because so often people will dismiss and ignore disability when it's a good representation.
Yes.
And only talk about it when there is when they want to demonize it. Yes. So they'll if you get, it's the same way that when you get science fiction that's like really quality storytelling, people will try and put that into a different category. So they'll say, that E.T. is a family film instead of going, oh, this is fantasy science fiction.
Oh, yep.
There's this desire to kind of pave over that element, and I think that happens a whole lot with disability in so many places where it would be, it's an opportunity to really talk about it and open up those conversations. People just go, oh, but that's not even a thing we're gonna worry about. Let's just let's talk about the fact that it's a kids movie. And it's like, no, let's talk about the fact that it's a kids movie with disability in it.
Yes.
Let's talk about the fact that this is a disabled character and bring that to the foreground of this conversation and why that's important, and let that facilitate conversations about why we need disabled heroes and why that's important, and give people a chance to talk with their kids about disability. So I didn't mention it when I introduced myself, but I have Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, which is a collagen disorder. That means all of my joints are very unstable. It affects all of the connective tissue in my body, a number of my other, overall systems as well. And I have some related issues. I POTS, which is postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, mast cell dysfunction, and a whole bunch of other fun things with big words. But I'm an ambulatory wheelchair user, which means sometimes I use a wheelchair, sometimes I don't. I like to say I'm the riddle of the Sphinx. Sometimes I'm on 2 legs, sometimes on 3 with a cane, and sometimes I'm on wheels. But, you know, again, ambulatory wheelchair users are something that have been kind of erased. We've been stuck in this idea of a very binary system of disability. You're either completely one thing or completely not. But you look at blindness, it's not an on-off switch. It's 90% of blind people have some vision.
That's wow, yeah.
Yeah. And so, you know, people get harassed if they are using their phone, or if they're able to, like, if they're using the vision that they have. Because people then say, oh, you're not really blind. You're not really deaf. You're not really a wheelchair user. You absolutely are. You just, the problem is people aren't aware that that's the reality of most disability.
It's, oh gosh. That's, okay, yes. First, thank you. Because there's even stuff that I don't know, and stuff that I, like, am always glad to be reminded of, because it's not as often talked about and, like, just acknowledged as it should be. So it's a commonplace thing, as it should be. And we definitely don't see it as often in gaming, because there's, from my opinion, there's the idea that a character with a disability isn't perfect. And it's a stupid idea. And I'm just going to, like, happily say that. In the Rime of the Frost Maiden game that I'm playing, my character, Vidrux, lost his hand. And I actually reached out to 2 other disability consultants, literally because I was like, I don't know how to do this. Because, like, I don't want to automatically lean into the idea that, oh, it's a magic world, anything can be fixed, because not everything is, like, broken per se. And, like, after talking to them and, like a couple episodes of exploring the concept, he has a prosthetic hand now. And, like, the prosthetic was actually, like, improved and advanced so that it can, like, hold a shield that shoots out, and it's covered in, like, a beautiful onyx black coating, and it's so freaking cool.
That's so cool.
And I love it. I leaned into it. He's a paladin of, like, the Draconic Pantheon, so each of the fingers are, like, a different color to represent Tiamat's heads. And I'm like, this is the coolest damn thing. And, like, I never would have thought about it. And it's like the word of him being a disabled character does not mean that he is not still a badass. And I had a moment during the stream, because people will sometimes make jokes about things. And there was one joke that really, really pissed me off. And it was that as a paladin, he uses lay on hands. And when he lost one of his hands, the joke was he's using lay on hand. And I literally stopped the stream and said, we're not going to make that joke. We're not going to make that joke, because that's not funny. That's not funny to someone who has actually lost a hand. That's not funny to someone who is doing something good. And I understand people wanting to make, like, fun, even if it's something they might relate to. But if it's not your disability, you do not have the right to make a joke about it, even if it's, like, for someone's character. And that,
I think the ownership is a really important part of it. And I think you raised something that I really think is important to address. You talked about the idea of fixing disability. And so there are two I'm going to get briefly into some disabled theory here. I did study disability academically as well. I studied disability studies in college. So there are kind of 2 prevailing ideologies around disability. There's what's been traditionally the model that has been used, which is the medical model, which is, if you're disabled, you have something that is medically wrong. You need to be treated. It needs to be fixed. You are deviant from the norm.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's something called the social model, which is what most people who are working in disability rights subscribe to, which is the idea that when you have a large sampling of people, you are going to have natural variance in bodies and brains.
That makes sense.
The same way that you'll have short people, tall people, different hair colors, different eye colors, different skin colors. All of it is that's normal. And that doesn't mean anything's broken. The problem is the thing that's broken is the fact that we have an inaccessible society.
Yes.
And that people are being denied equal access and equal treatment.
Yep.
So that's the social model of disability. So many people who are disabled feel very strongly that our lives are not made worse by our disabilities. Our bodies are our bodies, or our brains are our brains.
Yeah.
And that's fine.
Yep.
We're good with it. We don't need to be fixed. There may be issues that need to be treated in terms of, basic health care. But that's a fundamentally different thing than you are broken and need to be fixed.
Yes. Well, can I ask you a question then?
Yeah.
So like, I also think that when people who are not considered disabled try to ask why they're seeing it in games, they don't seem to understand that it's not just they're imparting what they view as the norm and saying, well, you know what, I'm not used to this. But it's especially ridiculous to me in fantasy games, because disabled representation is going to be one of the most realistic things you see in a fantasy game. If you have an entire species that can fly, and then they see a human, like a normal human, a person with magic.
Oh my gosh, you poor thing! What happened to you? What happened to your wings?
Correct.
Why, how do you get to your home?
Exactly.
Yep.
And like that.
And also,
it doesn't make sense.
When you have monsters constantly ravaging,
yes,
and you have people making a handful of gold maybe a year,
yes,
who do you think is paying for all of those restorations, those high-level clerics? Where's that coming from? How's that healthcare working?
This is me intentionally.
How do I get on that healthcare system where they pay for very, very, very expensive treatment?
This is me intentionally throwing shade. But if there is a fantasy universe where people can see through different dimensions, people can breathe fire, people can fly, and maybe your character can't do that, why would you have trouble with a dungeon having a ramp if someone may have issues walking?
I'm going to make it more mundane. Do spectacles exist in your world? Do people wear glasses? That's an accessibility device. People don't think about being nearsighted or farsighted as a disability. It absolutely is. If you wear glasses,
I cannot drive if I'm not wearing my glasses.
You're using an accessibility device, and so no one asks people who are wearing glasses what happened to them or what's wrong with them. Yeah. I would love to see our world get to a place where a wheelchair is the same situation. Yeah. But also, like, people seem to think that this is not the norm. The disabled community is the largest minority in the U.S. We're 1 in 4 people. It's more than 25% of the population. And then that's not even necessarily accounting for aging, at which point essentially everyone acquires disability.
Yeah.
In one form or another. So it's a very large group of people. But because of the way that we have been, historically institutionalized, the history of eugenics that's involved in this, forced sterilization, like there's a lot that's historically been pretty intense.
Yeah.
This has been ugly laws, which were a big thing, and said if you didn't meet standards of certain appearances, you weren't allowed in public. So people have decided that this is this very othered thing, and it really isn't.
Yeah.
Um,
So if any of you don't know, Jen recently like actively made sure that in their dungeon there were ramps, and people are sadly not as surprising, obnoxious and stupid. And I mean this so genuinely. If you would be considered an abled person and you had the option of stairs or ramps to go up or down, I'm willing to bet at least 90% of you would pick the ramp, even if you were a abled person. It's significantly easier just in general. I I'm fortunate to have no issues with my legs. And if there is a ramp versus stairs, I will always take the ramp if I can, and I'm not going to inhibit anyone else who is using it, because it's less strain on your legs just in general. They're meant for that.
yeah, and I think I want to note a couple of things. There is long-standing precedent for this in D&D. This is not something that I just like invented to go, push a progressive agenda into Dungeons and Dragons. This goes back to OD&D, where detect sloping passageways was a thing. That absolutely has been part of the game since then, but in 5th edition specifically, you look in your DMG on page 99 at the bottom, there's a paragraph about how in UNT temples they have ramps instead of stairs, because the form of a dungeon needs to follow the function of the dungeon. So you're looking at who lives there, why they're there. Dungeon doesn't mean a subterranean sepulcher. It can mean anything from a cathedral to a mansion to a tree. There's all sorts of things it could be. A dungeon just means a location that the PCs go to either retrieve an object, to explore, to encounter creatures, to rescue someone. It's a location for a story to progress that involves exploration and combat. So yeah, it's not something new. It's not something I created. And the other funny thing I find is a lot of the people who are so upset are people who have been pushing really, really hard for us to get off of the Sword Coast in D&D. And my adventure brings back Tashalar, which is off of the Sword Coast and hasn't been in the game in a couple of editions. So I'm like, I thought people would be excited about that, but instead they're worried about how you get from level to level in the dungeon, and it's just not. It's a shame, because I think when people see it, there's going to be a moment of internalizing, oh, we were upset about that.
Yes.
And then there's going to be blowback on that front too. That it's not enough, but the real answer is making things accessible is not actually that difficult, particularly if you start from the beginning and think about that inclusion from the beginning.
It's like color blindness. When people change things for Among Us has been a very popular game, and there's one mini game in Among Us where it involves using wires that are a specific color, and they realized that people were having trouble with them because of color blindness, so they added symbols to the wires, and that was all it took.
Yeah, it's really not nearly as hard as people think it is. And it makes a big difference, but I think it's really important for people to have the opportunity to, for a lot of people, if they were to write an adventure where they made a place that people like them were able to go, or exist, there would be no problem with it. But because I did the same thing, it's a problem.
Yes. And I'd be willing to bet that if I had it's someone thinking that you're doing something for your own agenda. If I had made a dungeon that had ramps in it, I don't imagine anyone would have said anything because they're like, oh, Gabe's just doing things. But oh,
Mhm.
Jen is a wheelchair user and put dungeons with ramps in it. Oh, they're really just trying to no, they're just designing things and actively trying to normalize it.
Yeah. I mean, why can't a fantasy city have ramps?
I
Why not?
it's and it the thing that blows my mind with that as well is that you can do things for accessibility purpose and not just in the accessibility of a disabled person.
Mhm.
Because
Oh yeah, you
if
look
you're
at a
moving a
curb cut.
cart, yeah,
So curb cuts have benefited people who have strollers, people who are taking hand trucks of, uh, you know, drinks or books, or who are moving. All of that they came into being because of disabled people, but they are beneficial to everyone. If you enjoy voice to text on your phone, you can thank disabled people. All of this is, it's just, again, it's this reskinning of things and the normalization of these things after the fact, and then the erasure of the people who brought them into being. But it's, I think it is. It's I've got to think it's getting better in some ways, because we're having this conversation,
yes,
which is something that wouldn't necessarily have happened
yeah,
a while ago. And even having the blowback, it's something that is being discussed. And I've been playing this game almost 20 years. I love it so much. um
you should be able to see more of yourself in a game that you love.
mm-hmm.
That's like
Yep.
there's no way around it. You should
Yep.
be able to. And anyone that plays tabletop games should be able to see themselves in the games. I was playing in a cyberpunk game yesterday with Mustang art, and they have a cyber chair that is specifically designed for the game. Like, and whether you're looking at it from an accessibility standpoint or just a that's cool as hell standpoint, the fact that it exists, it's awesome and necessary.
Mm-hmm. 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's, and I think it's not even just that you should, you know be able to see yourself in the game, but I think that people, I really am a firm believer in the idea, and there's been a decent amount of research into this. If you look at something like the 6 Feet Under studies, which talked about how people reacted. It was a study about homophobia before and after people watched 6 Feet Under, where they had the humanization of a gay character,
Mm-hmm.
often for people who were, they would score much higher on a homophobia scale prior to watching the show.
Yeah.
So I think the stories we tell have a very strong real world impact on how we think about other human beings.
Yes.
And I think stories can build compassion and empathy,
Mm-hmm.
um, and give us awareness of experiences that are not our own. And so I think that having the consideration of even taking that moment and going, oh, I could totally put a wheelchair using NPC into this dungeon. That may not be a thought someone had before. And maybe that helps start that conversation. Maybe that opens that up for a table or
Yeah.
two, or allows someone who's an ambulatory wheelchair user who's been hiding it to start bringing their chair to the game and feel more comfortable, which allows them to enjoy the game more because they now know that it's okay. They're allowed to exist in the world,
Yeah.
and feel like they're not
I would really love to see
erased.
more artificers that were wheelchair users
Mm-hmm.
because there's so much that you can do with that in just like in a narrative and mechanic way. I had an NPC who was using crutches, and the party never actually found out, but one of their crutches was a staff, like a magical staff.
Mm-hmm.
And it's I would say that if you cannot add accessibility to your storytelling, then you're actively choosing not to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But I also want to see like blacksmiths who are wheelchair users, and I want to see just people living in the world doing their thing too, because I want to see the cool, like the spies who are based on one of the most famous, or the most notorious spies too, from World War II, I believe, was an amputee who hid all sorts of stuff in her prosthetic.
Yes.
And like, yeah, she's amazing. And so there's tons of cool rogue ideas there, or hiding your material components there and trying to pass yourself off as a non-magic user. Like, there's all sorts of cool stuff you can do with that. But also just like people going about their lives with their families and their, just doing their thing.
Yeah.
And having that be just in the background of your world, and not having disability be specifically a focal point.
Yeah.
Having it be just in the world.
When you normalize it doesn't have to be something that you're like, oh wow, like praise for doing something is sometimes good. But sometimes you don't want praise because you want that to just be the norm.
Yep, exactly. And you just don't want it to have to be exceptional, in any way, whether it's, villains or heroes, or, obviously when you're talking about like player characters, those are heroes normally. I mean, they can be villains too, but they are exceptional in some way.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about NPCs, you're going to meet a lot of people who aren't major players in whatever's happening in the world, and including people from all groups in that is just, it's a way to keep from tokenizing and objectifying people.
So you said, I'm trying to remember the word. Was it ambulatory wheelchair user?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So like I feel like that is a prime example of, if you're storytelling and you, like, someone wants to normalize that, if you want to introduce, like they go to the blacksmith or something, and they meet this figure Ren, and Ren is standing working at their forge. The next time they meet Ren, if they're in the wheelchair, because you don't have to introduce them. Don't try to introduce them as a character who is disabled. Just introduce them as a person sometimes. Probably more often than not.
Yeah, or you can have a wheelchair nearby.
True.
And Ren says, "Hang on, I'll be right with you." Walks over, sits down in their chair, and moves over.
That's perfect.
And then you probably likely will have to address that in some way, because your players may not be familiar with the idea of ambulatory wheelchair users. Because it's so much not a known thing that people make memes of people who are there was a woman at the supermarket who reached up to a shelf to grab something, to grab a bottle of alcohol, and there was a whole meme that went around, saying something about like how alcohol cures all ills or something, which on so many levels is a problem. But specifically, it's like, no, she's an ambulatory wheelchair user, like many wheelchair users.
Yep.
Many to most of us can stand or walk for short distances of time, maybe even long distances, depending on the day. For me, I can get along pretty okay some days, and then some days I'm gonna really, really struggle. A convention, it's you're almost never gonna see me without some sort of device. It's just, I can't do that.
That makes sense.
It's too much walking, too much of a day. But you might see me part of the day without one. Does it mean I'm faking it? No. that's just how it goes.
So when this is an open, for those of you watching, this is an open-ended question that I'm about to ask Jen. Jen is also very experienced and knowledgeable in this sense, but is also not trying to be the end all for any of the things that you do and or say. She is going to
No.
try to be help and an asset, but as with all things, continue to learn and progress. So then my question for you, Jen, is what are some recommendations you have for someone if they're a DM, GM, and they want to introduce more characters that follow a disabled or like idea or like sense to their person, or like they want to try to introduce that for a character, and something else is resources on where to potentially look at disabilities that could be representation that is something they could understand, because there is, like we talked about, wheelchair users, and we talked about like technically like vision impairment, but there's also so many different ways that it could be represented positively that people probably don't even consider.
Yeah. So the first thing I want to reiterate something you said, which is the disabled community is not a monolith. We all have different different preferences in terms of language use and our feelings about how these things are dealt with. So I can only speak for myself and not the whole community. It's always more important that you ask the disabled people in your life that you talk to about their preferences. So just that, yeah.
Yes.
Disclaimer.
Yes. No, I yes.
But
Thank you.
um, but I have created the accessibility in gaming resource document, which has a ton of links covering everything from writing and characters to making more accessible conventions to tech tools to publishing tools. Pretty much you name it, if it is in the tabletop space and the convention type space, there should be some sort of link that will have resources for it. Stuff about language. I have a few essentials up top on there. The key one to me is a TED talk that a woman named Stella Young gave called "I Am Not Your Inspiration. Thank you very much."
Ooh, yes.
It's 8 minutes long and it is brilliant. It's hilarious. It's wonderful. Go watch it. Please go watch it. But in there, I have links to a number of different mechanics. I have a link to Mustang's Arts combat wheelchair. I have a link to Sleepy Spoony's mechanics, which is a hugely comprehensive list. I have a couple of links to the to Phaonix's ableism and tabletop articles. So those are all really great places to go. If you want to learn about disability, with really quality representation. A few things that are really fantastic. There's a show that was on Freeform that you can watch on Hulu called Everything's Gonna Be Okay, that has really wonderful autistic representation on it. So that's a really great example. There's a show on Netflix called Special that was written and has the lead has CP, creator and star. There is Years and Years, though be cautious with that one because it's intense and heavy, especially in this particular period in time. It was a little weirdly prophetic, but that was Russell T Davies' HBO series, but it's brilliant, and it has Ruth Madeley in it, who is a brilliant actress with spina bifida, who's an ambulatory chair user. It's the first time I had seen an ambulatory chair user on TV. And we all, like my friends and I, were all texting, just going, "Did you see that? She stood up and walked to the couch." Like, it was a huge deal because you never see it.
Yeah.
But those are really quality representations. I also recommend starting to follow more disabled people on social media. Alice Wong is brilliant. She published a book called Disability Visibility this year, which is an anthology of writings by disabled people. Disabled people destroy science fiction. which is also an anthology. So there's tons of really amazing pieces of work out there to reference and read and learn from.
If you are a DM or GM or storyteller that is running a game and one of your players is disabled,
Mm-hmm.
I have 2 points that I want to make. One, allow them to have their disability represented in this world, and I feel like there's no right way to bring it up, but even if you just do it privately, give them that opportunity because they may not have had it before. They
Mm-hmm.
may have always had to play characters that were able to walk or didn't have any like biological things that they were working through. And it is a trust because you want to trust someone to not abuse that or not ruin that or not take that the wrong way. Uh, so if you're a storyteller and you're running a game for someone and this is something they've already shared with you, try to take that trust and harness it in the best way that you can so that they know they can have good experiences with the representation they want to see.
Yeah, I think communication is always going to be key,
Yeah.
and so I think that's always a really great session zero topic,
Mm-hmm.
is talking about ableism and what is going to be okay in the game.
Yeah.
Also privately talking with that person because I know there are some disabled people who don't want that in game. I know there are
Yep.
definitely some disabled people who don't feel the same way I do and feel like their disability is something they don't want to deal with when they're gaming and
Exactly.
don't want to be confronted with because they're confronted with it all day.
Yep.
Um, so for me, I'm like I don't want ableism in my game. Like that's not something I want. But yeah, I'd
Yes.
like to have the option, and I'd like to have disabled characters in the world.
True.
But someone else may not feel the same way. So talk to people. But at the same time, also keep in mind things like um, making sure you have comfortable ways for people to communicate uh, access needs to you.
Mm-hmm.
Think about things like taking breaks, because not just for your neurodiverse players, but for your neurotypical players
Yes.
or non-disabled players. So for me, I try and take breaks every hour and a half to 2 hours. That seems to be kind of the sweet spot, both for my own needs, but also with players in terms of attention span. That taking five at a 2 hour mark or an hour and a half mark
Mm-hmm.
seems to, I've found that I've had great returns in terms of player attention and excitement and energy levels, as long as those breaks are taken regularly, and then alternating those with longer breaks if every 4 hours or so.
Yeah.
Um, but that's a really simple access thing you can do. Also think about things like music. If you have music going, that could be overstimulating for someone. For someone with an auditory processing disorder, that can be it can make it really tough to focus on what other people are saying.
Yeah.
Think about whether people are visual or auditory or kinesthetic when
Mm-hmm.
you're designing your gameplay styles, your adventures. Do they need maps and minis? Do they need virtual tabletop? Do they need a dice roller? Do they need, what helps to make the game the most fun for your group that it can be? Again, this is a conversation point, and also keeping an eye on the group and seeing what people are responding to.
Yeah.
But opening up those points of conversation.
Mm. 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 My heart is very happy. Um, what has been uh I'm sure there have been a couple. What are some moments when you were playing in a tabletop game and it was subtle but you felt seen and acknowledged?
Hmm.
Or have there been those moments recently? Cuz it's I don't feel like it's a bad thing if there haven't been, but I also feel like it's the kind of thing that like I want more of.
Yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, I can't think of a ton of times when I recall in a game feeling like I was having a ton of representation
Mm-hmm.
happening. Um, I will say I loved creating the dungeon that we were building during the D&D celebration panel.
Mm-hmm.
Because we had a panel. It was an all disabled panel,
Yeah.
but that was not what we focused on directly during the panel. We
Yeah.
used designing a dungeon as a way to discuss disability
Yeah.
and to frame it um, through that lens. But we built a dungeon that was in like a rogues guild, a thieves guild, with a manticore up top, and just it was an accessible dungeon. The puzzles were really cool, like having a braille thieves cant and having stuff on the ground on the floor
Mm-hmm.
that you could feel with your feet as you were walking through.
That's so cool.
Yeah, and those things were all things that were being informed by disability and giving us interesting new ways to approach it. It's also something that I've brought in, like high perceptions. You know, people often go, oh, there's no way with a high passive perception my players, I can't ever, you know, get anything passed on them. Well, no, if you think about passive perception under the framework of something like autism, where you're getting all of this sensory input, where you're looking at the thing and you're picking up all of this information, you're getting all of the information, but you also have to be able to parse it out and figure out
Mm-hmm.
what's important and what's not.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think for me, I've gone higher passive perceptions kind of start to go into that realm,
Mm.
which is an interesting. Here are 15 pieces of information. You need to
That's
figure out what's relevant. You're getting that there's a hidden door, but you're also getting that there are, you know, 74 cobblestones around it, and that there's uh, this particular shape in the thing, and that there
yeah.
are, you know, 187 ants, and there's like, you know, and
That's
that's something you
genius.
can have to crack before you can go, oh, there's a door here.
Mm-hmm.
um so
That's so
interesting stuff.
cool.
Yeah.
It's it goes to show when people people with different experiences, uh if someone is learning and speaking to and designing with a person with a disability, you're going to get a whole bunch of information and consideration you probably never would have thought of, and it's going to be an amazing boon to that process. Because like
Mm-hmm.
you were saying, none of you were necessarily trying to design a dungeon for the disabled. You were designing a dungeon with this knowledge in your head and this extra layer of consideration, and
Mm-hmm.
it improves your design.
Mm-hmm. You think about things, you know, from different perspectives, and you explore it from different angles and come at it with a different approach, I think. um, there's something in the deaf community called deaf gain,
Mm-hmm.
which is sort of the benefits that people have from being deaf, like the places where they feel they've gained advantages
Yeah.
from being deaf. And I think a lot of us feel that there are similar things with our disabilities. For me, planning has become something that I've gotten very, very good at, because I never know how much energy I'm going to have. Because part of what I deal with is chronic fatigue and chronic pain, and so depending how I'm feeling, I may or may not be able to get through my whole to-do list that
Yeah.
day. And you know, with my schedule, that can be a problem.
Yeah.
So I got very good at planning. Without my disability, I would not be nearly as good a producer, because I will have contingency plans for everything. Whenever something goes wrong, I have a plan in place to deal with it because I have to.
Yeah.
I also can find the kind of most ability is exclusively a negative, and it's not true. There are things that you learn, and also the kind of the neural rewiring that happens. You know, if you suddenly become blind, then it's like putting on a blindfold, and you are going to have trouble navigating and getting around. But if you are blind for a long time, your brain actually, your neural processing reroutes. So your
Really?
attention is, your attention's going to go to the other inputs that you need awareness of. And it's not a superpower. You don't, you're not Daredevil. That's a whole, that's not how it goes. And also, like, the superpowered disabled person is a trope that is not great.
Yeah.
But you do have actual neural rewiring. The same way that if you're deaf and you suddenly get a cochlear implant, people think that you're suddenly going to be able to understand everything. No, you're just going to start getting input that makes no sense, because it's just you've never needed to use that before, and you've never heard those sounds necessarily.
Can you expand on what a cochlear implant is?
Yeah, absolutely. A cochlear implant is an implant with an external magnetic component that functions sort of like a hearing aid, but it is a processor. You have a processor that processes sound, and allows some people who are deaf, not all deaf people, to have hearing on, and it has varying degrees of effectiveness.
Yeah.
It also tends to be very mechanical sounding.
Okay.
You can hear online various examples of what a cochlear sounds like, but often hearing people think of cochlear implants as like the be all end all of, like, we've cured deafness, and that's not what it does. And many deaf people choose not to have cochlear implants or use hearing aids. So yeah, it's really interesting, because, and I'm going to speak about this in terms of wheelchair, but often people will like design wheelchairs that go upstairs. People are like, yeah, but we don't need that. What we need is the ramps to be put in. Like, we have technology right now that allows us to do that, and we don't want that. We want just to be able to use what we have and just get the access. Like, this is an unnecessarily complex, dangerous thing that's going to break down and be very expensive to repair, instead of this simple technology that we have that we can implement if we would just implement it. Yes. So I think often non-disabled people try and strategize these things out for disabled people, and it's coming from a good place, but is not, or the sign language gloves that can interpret sign, but they completely neglect the fact that facial expression is part of the grammar of ASL. So it doesn't help. So yeah, it's instead what we need is people to let the communities advocate for our own needs, and then get support on those fronts. But yeah, but what I was trying to say is, like, the neural reprogramming that happens, your brain will focus energy on these other things. So if you are blind for a long period of time, your brain is going to put energy into your other sensory inputs so that you can maintain spatial awareness, and you're not going to have trouble navigating. You're going to create other systems to get around, whether that's a tactile system, whether it's a system of, some people use clicking. They make a clicking sound and use almost like an echolocation process. Whether it's, working with a sighted guide or a guide dog, or, any number of things. Now there are some new technologies. But yeah, getting involved with understanding the ideas that fixing things is not actually always going to be the kind of instant fix that people think it is.
It makes me happy. Okay. if you have a question, you can put question in all caps, and then you put the word question in all caps, and then put your question afterwards. Your actual question does not have to be on all caps, and the mods will get that. We will go over some questions later on. We still have plenty of time, but Jen, genuinely, thank you for taking the time to talk with me about this stuff, because like there's stuff that I'm learning. I knew of ambulatory wheelchair users, but I didn't actively know the term myself. And that's huge for me. Just to have that information. It has me thinking of positive ways to represent things and also normalize them. Like there's in plenty of fantasy games and D&D especially, there is emphasis on lip reading, and it is not something that is an end all be all, but it can be something that helps. If you have a character that is deaf, and I don't feel like I see very many characters that are represented as deaf, really.
Nope.
Ever. And there's so much possibility for it. There's the ability to read lips, to understand, to just be around, and saying that there are advantages to it is it feels backhanded, but there are ways that you can make a disabled character have a boon that the others don't, because of understanding and comprehension and mindset.
And look, I don't think anyone is saying that disabled characters, if you're talking about mechanics specifically, that if you have a blind character, penalties on perception rolls that rely on sight, no one's saying, oh, you can't have penalties on perception rolls that rely on sight. That's absolutely not what we're talking about. What we are saying is there are other things that those people may be more effective at, or maybe there are solutions like having using the Warlock Eyes of the Fiend, where you're using a pact familiar and using their senses instead. So you're using that effectively. You're getting a different angle on it, and it's going straight into your mind, and in terms of shapes or textures. Maybe you have a little stone in your hand that reshapes to map the room. You know, there's so many different things you could do to create new ways to approach stuff in world.
Part of the reason a deaf character could be seen by others as so powerful is because spells that you have to hear or verbal don't affect them in that same way. It doesn't even mean that they can't communicate either through sign or even telepathy. But this is something that makes them, like, even if they're disabled, so powerful. And
so, I mean, how about this? Here's a character pitch.
Yes.
There's a character who's become legendary because they've survived these encounters with these powerful spellcasters. Over and over, they've survived. And really what's happened is they're deaf. They became deaf later in life. So they were hearing for the earlier part of their life. So they have unaccented speech. No, weird words for me to stumble over, but there you have it. And have learned to lip read or have figured out other solutions. Turns out the entire reason that they've been able to survive those things and have been able to rally that power and rally their following is because they are deaf and we're not affected by hearing the spells. I mean, there's something really cool in that kind of character, and that's a really neat secret for players to discover. Maybe they have an interpreter and they have their own very subtle sign language that they use together.
Like a familiar.
Could be a familiar. It could be a an assistant or like a vizier.
it's
Could be
dope.
anything, like so many different things. I
That's-
was talking the other day with Todd, and we were talking about the idea of a librarian who
mhm.
has a blind librarian
Yeah.
who basically has created the ability to have audiobooks. They've just
That's
cast
genius.
spells so the books read out loud to them, and they can file them away. And there's no reason you couldn't have that work. As you know, that's a combination of a job you would not normally pair with that disability,
Yeah.
but it's absolutely a functional thing. But also, I think there's so much you could do in terms of Thieves' Cant. I love Thieves' Cant and Braille, and like the idea of hidden messaging because it's in Braille on the same piece of paper that something else is written and nobody recognizes except for the
Mm.
blind character. You know, it just
Mm-hmm.
interesting stuff there. Um,
Oh, that's so
so
cool. So okay. One of the things that I thought of was sending.
mhm.
And sending is literally a spell that says you send a brief message of up to 25 words. And something like that I'm thinking of thematically is that it never says how the message is sent. So you could send that message literally in any way. It could literally be a visual thing that they see in their head that is the sign language. It could
Well, and okay, so I told you that in sign grammar, facial expression is grammar, right? But
yes.
also, uh, scale in sign, you can express so much in sign. You can express like multi-word phrases with one sign based on how
That's
you
true.
scale it, how you express with your face. You know, that all can be in there. So that's almost a way to min max that spell. Um, but yeah.
You know what? Sending does have somatic components. So that's all I'm gonna say. That's
Yeah, and so Alindra has on you know, one of the characters I play is a wizard who lived with a clan of ghostwise halflings
mhm.
for a long time. Ghostwise halflings traditionally don't speak, and for me, I instantly was like, oh, because they're mostly deaf. So it's a mostly deaf group, um, uh, and that it makes sense that, like on Martha's Vineyard, where there's a long history of a lot of deaf families living together. Um, it would make sense that this would be a large collection of deaf families, and um, so Alindra learned to sign with the Ghostwise halflings,
Mhm.
um, and so she has the ability to cast her verbal components as sign when she needs to, as well, um, which was one thing that was a learned skill,
Yeah.
um, that tied directly to the backstory. But specifically, it was like looking at that and going, to me, this feels like an obvious thing about Ghostwise halflings. That makes perfect sense. You have a canonical group that why wouldn't you plug that in there?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think there's just opportunities all over. When you're talking about subterranean creatures, why would they need vision? When you're deep in the underground where there is, you know, if you're in the Underdark and you don't need light, why do you really need dark vision? Or could you get by with tremor sense?
Mm-hmm. Because tremor sense will probably give you more information, and like tremor sense isn't. Tremor sense is going to tell you what's around the corner. Vision isn't
Mm-hmm.
until you go around the corner,
Mm-hmm.
and especially if it's for self-preservation and survival.
Yeah. So this stuff doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to necessarily be. I mean, it can be stuff that's related to consequences of adventuring,
Mm-hmm.
but it also can just be because it makes more sense for these people or creatures in their lives.
it literally just gets cooler the more you think about it. Like that's literally just all I've been thinking about now is like, well, I like the idea of a wizard who emphasizes signs, and part of their subclass is that they can always replace verbal components with somatic.
Hmm.
And I'm like, and when you think of fantasy magic and words, you can think of runes, and
Hmm.
runes could literally just be signs. And I'm like, God, it's just cooler
Also,
the more I think
like
about it.
when you start thinking about like Dark Sun, the way that people would embroider their spell books into their clothes or put them into jewelry, carve them into jewelry and stuff. You can think about that in terms of dyslexia. Maybe that's part of why they use runes instead of written language. There's all sorts of things.
Oh my God, you're right.
Yeah, the second you start tugging on any of these threads, you can find really creative uses for these ideas. Um, and I think that's part of, you know, what disabled people do is find creative solutions and workarounds because we have to. But when you carry that into fantasy, there's really fascinating ways to go
Mm-hmm.
with it.
Okay.
So,
Awesome. 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 Oh my gosh, this has been okay. So I have a first question. Um,
yes.
what are your thoughts on non-disabled players creating and playing characters with disabilities? And should those players create rules for the disabilities, find other rules, or just don't associate any rules to those disabilities?
So, I think that, and again, we're not a monolith. This is just my personal perspective. Um, I am happy to have non-disabled people playing disabled characters in fantasy, with the caveat that you are doing that with respect, with doing your homework, and ideally reaching out and talking to disabled people. I mean, in a perfect world, you are, you know, taking someone for coffee, or kicking some money to someone's tip jar or something, to have that conversation because you're using their time and their energy and their resources. But talking to a disabled person who lives that experience and getting input on it. I think, and failing that, doing some reading what that experience is like, seeing if you can understand, because I've talked about this before, but so if I show you that I'm holding my soda,
Yes.
most people won't notice this, but even my disability affects down to the way I hold my soda.
Oh
Cold,
wow.
I have something called Raynaud's. It affects my circulation.
Mm-hmm.
My fingertips will turn like blue or white very easily,
Oh
and
wow.
it also gets very, very painful for me. So I hold things with as little of my skin touching the cold part as possible. Um, it's something most people won't think about, but for me, that's how deeply and subtly this manifests for me. Um, Things like people feeling the texture under their feet, blind people noticing differences in textures under their feet. Um, those are things that non-disabled people might not have an awareness of, that can play into your character and become really interesting character moments. But you won't necessarily pick up on those unless you're reading the experiences or talking to people who live those experiences. So doing your homework, I think, is really important. In terms of rules, I think looking at something like the Fate Accessibility Toolkit, which is a phenomenal resource that was written by disabled people who have the disabilities that they're writing about. That was spearheaded by Elsa Huneson, who is deafblind and is a brilliant designer and author. She's a Nebula Award winner and is just phenomenal. I think that gives a bunch of great information, both about the experience of those disabilities and then some ideas for rule sets.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the Sleepy Spoonie mechanics were all done with consultation. Obviously, Mustang's Art's combat wheelchair. Sarah is a wheelchair user, an ambulatory wheelchair user. So using mechanics designed by disabled people who have had that lived experience is always preferable to designing your own if you can get consultation on rules you're creating, if you are going to create rules, and if you really don't, if it's something that you don't think you can do in a way where you're really understanding the nuance of it and where the positives are and where the negatives are, then I would say don't add any rules.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense. It's the kind of thing where it's like, it really sucks that this is the case, but intent does not always and often doesn't validate negative end results.
Mm-hmm.
Having the best intentions, but sometimes gamifying it to a point that they're it allowing it to exist inhibits the ability to have fun, means that the execution could have and probably should have been different.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's something that you want. Some people will want it to be a real experience for them, and I'd say that should be more if it is a disabled player. If it's a non-disabled player trying to represent it, it is another piece of them, and if they have the consultation from it, like how you were talking about, they might have a better way to approach it, but it always has to be respectful.
Yeah. So like simulation experiences, so like people who use a wheelchair for a day or a week, or trying to navigate something being blindfolded to try and understand the experience of a disabled person who lives with that full time, it's a really troublesome issue.
Yeah.
But I think when you're talking about fantasy, you're never going to be able to completely represent an experience in mechanics. Like it's just not possible. But I think understanding that there is nuance that people haven't been aware of, so something like a blindness deafness spell, to me, I'm like, well, why can't that be a spectrum of how well it works when you cast it? Like,
That's true.
1 to 20, roll a d20, see where you are on that scale.
That's awesome. That's so clever.
Something I've been
Jen,
playing with a lot
what was the
recently.
name? You said El Hazan? What was the name?
Elsa Hunnesson.
Elsa Hunnesson.
SJUNNESSON.
Thank you. Okay. So Elsa, and one more time?
I'll put it in chat.
Bless. Thank you. Thank you so much. And there was another question, so if you can pull that one up for me, Lauren.
But and it is the book is also linked in the document.
Perfect.
There was one other piece of that I was saying. I don't know. Oh, what I was going to say is part of this process of everybody learning about things we didn't know about or experiences we may have been ignorant of in the past is we're going to make mistakes. We're going to screw up. It's part of the learning process. And I think accepting that that's something that we all do, and then learning from those mistakes and moving forward is something that's really important. Just learning to kind of go, whoops, screw that up. Sorry about that. And then not do it again is really important. And I think in terms of disability, that's no different. So I think going into this, being aware that you may make mistakes, you'll probably get something wrong, and that's okay because you're trying. As long as you're willing to own it when you have made a mistake and I would rather people try and make mistakes than not make the effort at all.
Yes.
Yeah.
So someone asked, and we kind of touched on this a little bit, but I have something that I've done for this one, and I am curious of your input. For people playing blind characters, whether actually visually impaired or not, how do you deal with that mechanically? Since blindness is a very big detriment mechanically in 5e, and it's into the blinded condition. And what I had actually done was, because we had talked about you'd mentioned it in a way that I hadn't understand the biological process of your brain putting the process power somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
I actually made it so that they would not be affected by the blinded condition, and instead,
Mm-hmm.
mechanically, they just had a tremor sense up to a certain area, and like because they had adjusted to it over time, and that was the way that the character had chosen to.
Yeah, it's Toph from Avatar.
Yeah. Yep.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's absolutely one way to do it. I think, the idea of giving a guide familiar and having that function instead, and
So
as
cool.
long as you have your guide familiar, you're getting that will help with those checks and neutralize that. But you're also still going to be immune to, and to me, a guide familiar is combat neutral. That all is. If the blinded condition applies, then it's going to apply to the familiar, and then you are going to be affected by it. Or you can have, if you're playing it with the tremor sense thing, you will be immune to the blinded condition and to but also to something like hypnotic pattern, because you can't see it.
Yeah.
So there are immunities that come out of it as well. Anything that's a visual input is, keeping where that works. But also thinking about it in terms of nuance, and does that person have any vision? How much, if so? What different accommodations do they have? Do they use a white cane type situation? Do they have the familiar? Do they use some sort of echolocation? Do they have a custom spell that lets them get the layout? Do they have something that gives them a tactile feedback that lets them have layout or know what's in front of them? I make all of my Shadar-kai are colorblind just off the bat, which ordinarily isn't an issue, and then once in a while you get a puzzle or something that is color based, and the characters will be like, hand me the red gem, and you're just like,
this one,
this one, no,
yeah.
This one, no, this, and it's an interesting, for me it's purely flavor, but it makes perfect sense because of where they come from, and knowing that everything in the Shadowfell's grayscale. So yeah, I think just there are a couple of different ways to approach that mechanic, but really what the blinded condition is applicable to is people who are not blind. There's a big difference between blind and blinded as a status effect.
That's a perfect just like clear point to me, because it's same thing for someone who is deaf versus being deafened.
Yeah, and also just while we're on blindness in tabletop, the blind monk trope is kind of worn out. It's something I will advise that people try and find creative new stories, because that has just been very that's very much become a trope, and we can do
I don't know
better.
why. Well, I probably know why.
Yeah.
It's so yes, it's that also brings me to another point. You should all know this. You can play a character without making them a trope. It's just, it doesn't have to be the character is this way, because you've always seen other characters who also have a similar experience be that way. And if that's the only comparison you have to do it, maybe don't play that character. If it has to be focused on the only other representation that you've seen, and it's not your own personal experience, then it's probably not a genuine one.
Yeah, it's also generally, if you're dealing with marginalized characters, their marginalization is often not the thing that drives them in their life. It's not usually their primary motivating factor.
Yes.
So, which is part of why the disabled villain trope is so troublesome.
Yes.
Yeah, because it reduces it to like, I am angry that I am disabled. I will kill everyone. Yeah. To quote Eddie Izzard. But I think going, okay, this is a person first. So not person first language. We do identity first language in this household. Sorry, identity first means saying I am a disabled person. Person first is a person with a disability. Person first tends to be language that was imposed on disabled people by non-disabled people to try and euphemize our existence and make people see us as people. To me, I'm like, the default is I'm a human being. Like, that should go without saying. I shouldn't have to go, hello, I am a person, who then
Wow, okay. That's
carries around a disability in my pocket.
it's
Like, no.
so obvious, but it's also like, damn, that's why isn't that just
But in the 90s, when that came to prominence, that was what we had to do, because it was the first time people, it's not true, it wasn't the first time that people were being public, but
yeah.
that was, especially in the 90s, that kind of was when it came to popularity. But yeah, for a lot of the disabled community, not all of us, but particularly people who are younger, there are still older disabled people who prefer a person with a disability, but generally the kind of younger disabled advocates prefer disabled person, because we can't be divested from it. It affects everything in our lives. And it informs our identity in the same way you wouldn't say person with gayness. you're a gay person. These things are, you're a queer person. It's innate in who you are as a human being. But terms like differently abled, special needs, these are all euphemistic terms. Disabled is not a bad word.
That's true.
It's a descriptor. It's like short, tall, whatever.
That's true.
So yeah, sorry.
No, don't apologize. This is huge. Like, this is stuff that I am fully aware of my own ignorance, and it's one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you about, like, the tabletop stuff and just this in general, because this conversation is with someone who is a dope as hell tabletop designer and is also a disabled person.
Thank you.
It like, they are not exclusionary, clearly. And I want that to be very clear. Like, the one of the reasons I was like, hey Jen, will you have this conversation with me, was because I was like, A, Jen does so freaking much. 2, Jen is a very friendly and open person. But also 3, you will say things that people probably need to hear, and in a way that makes so much sense. And it's not even you're not talking down to anyone. You're not assuming anyone's knowledge and not assuming anyone's ignorance, but still explaining it and having the conversation and making me, and I'm sure plenty of other people, aware of things that they just never considered. And it's what makes us better people and storytellers.
Thank you. I mean, I'm always learning too. I'm learning constantly from people like Alice Wong and Imani Barbaran and Christine Bruno, these incredible, brilliant, amazing human beings who are doing this work, and just
so that's another
have
interesting
taught me
standpoint.
so much.
Like, Jen is one of many, many, many other disabled people that are designers in the tabletop sphere. And something I want to ask anyone who's watching is, how many other designers that are disability advocates and designers on social media are you aware of? Because they're not hiding, and it's just provided visibility.
I'll give you a clue. There's at least one more on Candlekeep.
Yep. Lauren Wright just said. Lauren's streaming partner. Yep.
Yep. There it is. Yep. Kiana. Kiana Shaw is amazing. They are one of the creators of, along with Lauren, of the Tabletop Safety Toolkit, and cool. That is just such an incredible resource. And yeah, they're like it that's one of the really special things for me about being part of this book, is that Kiana also was part of the book, and that's a wall that we both got to be part of tearing down. So yeah, but there are a bunch of us who are doing this. It's a small group still, but it's a solid crowd, and it's people are getting more comfortable being open about it. And you know, we now have Mackenzie is now working at Wizards of the Coast, and that's amazing to have, you know,
it's
an openly disabled designer on full-time staff.
Yeah.
So that's a big deal.
We
also, Mackenzie's just
so freaking cool.
So freaking cool.
Like the nicest. I've gotten so many just random messages of support from Mackenzie on little things. And
she's the best.
Yeah.
Also, it's very upsetting how talented she is. Sometimes.
I agree.
Yep. She comes out and she's like, "Hi, I'm just out of school. Here, I will win awards on all of the things I write.
Yep.
And publish more than any of you have in like 5 minutes."
I really hope that there is one of the things I'm excited the most about Mackenzie's stuff is there is definitely going to be at least a handful of disabled kids who see that she joined the D&D team like full time and have the moment of, damn, I can do it too.
Yep.
Like,
but also Mackenzie's gonna come at it approaching with
it's the mindset you talked
about toward designing for autistic and neurodiverse players, as well as other disabled players, but coming at mechanics design just thinking about, is this going to be something that autistic players are going to be able to work with? Is this, are these things translatable for disabled characters? Can we include a way to make this more accessible? Can we think about ways to create more accessible mechanics products? That is so huge, and also will benefit everyone because universal design helps everybody. Universal design has 7 basic principles, and if you look in the doc, I have links to information on universal design.
Everything.
The document. So the document was like several years of work and links and things that I've been putting together, and I got tired. It's in some ways that is my laziness coming through, and or I'll rephrase that. In some ways, that is me being efficient.
There you go. There you go.
Me being energy efficient. I got tired of answering the same couple of questions, and so I decided to put it into a format that everybody could have, where I could go look at this and then come back to me if you still have the questions, and then we can have a higher order discussion. Like, it's going to be a better conversation at that point anyway, because you will have this basis, this foundation that we're starting from. You're
giving people the ability to find the information, and it makes a difference, because some people are either too afraid to ask, or a dozen people ask you, and as much as you want to, you can't respond to everybody. So you're like, here is the stuff that I would basically tell you, but it's written down already. You can spell everything. It's this is what you would hear from me, but it's now saved with links to other examples from multiple
and
people.
Also often said by people who can say it much more eloquently or have a lived experience that I don't have, where I am, relaying information that I have been told, but it is not my experience. Or my community. but also I want to make it clear that, and I'm only speaking for myself here. This is not for everybody, but I am always happy to answer questions that are from a place of genuine ignorance and not being aware, if you are open to having that conversation.
Yeah.
And it's not coming from like a malicious place of I'm gonna come ask ignorant questions because I can.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah. Happens too often.
yeah, I would rather people come and ask questions because they genuinely want to know answers and are not sure how to ask it any other way. Um, I'm always happy to answer those questions, time and energy and pain permitting. But
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
um,
I see we're getting more questions. So Lauren, if you can bring
yeah,
up another question, I'll answer another one. Um, Jen, this has been awesome.
I see a question about getting a Google Doc on an iPhone. Yes, you can.
Yes.
You should be able to follow that link, and you can also get the Google Docs app.
Okay. Okay. So here's one. Since disabled is a big label, is a good approach to say when choosing to disclose of disabilities is to say I'm a disabled person. I have X, Y, and or Z disabilities. Are there appropriate umbrella terms to use besides disabled?
Yes. So yeah, disabled is a very big label. It depends on the context, and disclosure is always a very personal thing. No one should ever be forced to disclose unless they feel comfortable and want to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it can be helpful in terms of getting accurate accommodation for your needs to be specific in what you need, because for example, I don't need an ASL interpreter at events, so I wouldn't. And I should say that many in the deaf community do not consider deafness a disability. It's again, we're talking about like variance in existence.
Yep, that makes sense.
And there are no things that deafness keeps you from doing other than hear. But that would normally fall under accommodations at an event, and that's not something I would need. So for me, I tend to specify that I'm disabled, I have a physical disability, I have a mobility disability, I'm an ambulatory wheelchair user, or getting down to the very specifics of my situation. There are categories of disability. Physically disabled, intellectually disabled.
Yeah.
So it really kind of comes down to what you are, why you are disclosing, in what circumstances, and what whether you are trying to, what you're whether it's to get accommodations or to inform or what.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very personal one, so that's tricky one. But yeah, disabled is a big label, and sometimes getting more specific can help, just for narrowing that field.
I'm glad that so something else that I appreciate when talking to you about this stuff is that you make it very clear that there are so many different ways that it can go. You always make it's always very clear that when Jen is speaking, they're talking about their own personal experiences, and it's very clear. And also noting there's no single answer to all of this, but here's some possibilities that may be some good ways to go about it, because it makes a difference. Because like I can very happily say that I have been watching the chat, and it's been positive and acknowledging and understanding and aware, and it's one of the best moments of being like, I really hope that this goes well, because this is important and I want to talk about it, and I want it to be like okay and good. And it's like, it's always been good experiences before, but you never know.
But it's been a week.
Yeah. Yes.
It's been a week of a lot of not that. So thank you, chat, for being lovely and kind and delightful. Because it's been a week.
Yeah.
It's been a week, and it's hard to not it can be really discouraging.
Yeah.
When you're just sitting there going, I exist. Hi, I want to exist in the thing I love, and people are going, yeah, you shouldn't exist. We don't want you. I think a lot about Whoopi Goldberg talking about why she took Next Gen. She's like, I wanted people to know there are Black people in the future.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I want people to know there are disabled people in fantasy.
Yes.
Like that it's okay. We can exist in your imagination. Because if we can't exist in people's imaginations, what does that say about what people think about us existing in the real world when we can't exist in your idealized fantasy universes? So that erasure is rough, and that has been extremely overt this week a lot of the time. But there's been a lot of really wonderful support, but there's also been a lot of not.
Yeah. So someone asked, would you hope to see like the accessibility and gaming resources in a supplement, like Tasha's or new editions of stuff? Honestly, my personal opinion, I would like, some of me would like to see it, but part of me wants it to be something separate that's out there, so that people don't have to pay for it, if that makes sense.
Yes. The first thing I would like to see is I would like to see it in the art.
Yes. Yes. Yep.
That I think that's one of the first places that it's important to me to have some representation. I would, yeah. And then I think from there, I'd like to I think having it be free is important, but also I want disabled designers to get paid because, the disabled community is so vastly unemployed and underemployed, like dramatically higher rates than the general population, and dramatically higher poverty rates. And on top of that, you throw in like medical needs and they are, people, here are some things that people don't think about. And I'm going to speak for the US, though these are fairly comparable internationally. In the US, we don't have marriage equality for disabled people, because if you get married and your household income goes over what is the baseline for SSI, you will lose your benefits. So most disabled people who are on SSI cannot marry their partners because it will put them over the thresholds and they will not be able to keep their benefits. Yeah, so marriage equality, big thing. We have subminimum wage. You can pay disabled people as little as $1 an hour because it is considered, they say that the work is an artifact of a law. And actually it is likely that in the stimulus package that this will change, but that the work is not of a comparable tier. So you can pay disabled people below minimum wage down to $1 an hour. So yeah, it's a community that is not being cared for. And this is all pre-pandemic stuff.
Yeah. It did not made it worse in a lot of ways. Jeez.
Oh yeah. Having people go, well, only old and high risk people are gonna get affected. How do you think that feels when you're a high risk person?
Yeah. Lord.
And so now we have with long-term COVID, we're having a huge increase in disability in this country.
Yeah.
And it's been very interesting to see what the adjustments have been now that, normal people are becoming disabled. It's been a very it's been very interesting.
I have something that after this show ends, I'm going to talk to you about, Jen, art-wise, talking about representation of disabled characters in fantasy art. So we're gonna have a conversation that these people don't get to know about, but we can talk about that more privately.
Oh, I'm excited.
Lauren, there was another question that just popped up. If you can pull that for me. Um, so someone said I wasn't gonna buy Candlekeep Mysteries because I don't really run pre-made adventures, but I've decided to buy now just to support the local game design community and see how Jen's design brain works. Can't wait to get it.
Oh, thank you so much. I really hope you enjoy it. Yeah, the accessibility is a very, very minor part of my adventure, to be completely honest. Like it's a feature of my dungeon. But there's but I have a really cool story. So that's also something to be excited about.
Yeah. So this one said,
Yeah.
thoughts on making PCs NPCs that are older and have disability full and diverse. As a carer, it's harder to see so many older characters to be so generic.
Yeah,
That's a
absolutely.
that's a great point.
I think we we do not treat older characters. Right. I mean, I think we have ageism as a is a really huge problem in our society in general. So you're already working with that bias, and then you throw in um, disability, and it just amplifies that. But again, it all comes back to making people. So I just played a character who was a disabled halfling grandma, who was also a punk rocker.
Yes.
And I chose to intentionally make it that she used a cane, which people assumed was because she was older. But in reality, she was an adventurer and had been in a fight with a Remoraz that had gone wrong when she was in her 30s. And so she had used her cane since her 30s. So she fought using her cane as a weapon. And she used it to also, in terms of reaching things, because she was a halfling. So it was a multi-purpose tool. And it was, but also she was a grandma, but she was a punk rocker. So we have these ideas that people can only be these stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
And I almost want people just to make tables of different characteristics.
Yes.
And roll on them. If you don't think you can kind of break yourself out of those molds, like make a table with a bunch of different characteristics and roll on it and play whatever you get. Or have everybody at your table write down a trait and then take all of those and play that character.
That'd
Or
be
pass
awesome.
them around. I've had my players, I stole a mechanic from 10 Candles where I had players write down a class on one index card and I had them write down a background on a different index card. So they all thought that this was what they were going to play for themselves. They started min-maxing it, and then I had them pass one to the right, one to the left. And then I had people going, how the heck am I going to be a warlock sailor? Next thing you know, they really started getting into. At first they were like, there's no way to make this actually an interesting character. And then they started getting really into it and digging into the story and coming up with these amazing elaborate backstories and getting really excited. So I think we come up with these ideas, and I'm as guilty of it as anyone, where you sort of get in your own rut of what your brain can come up with. And sometimes the randomization of those tables, or like the who the F is my D&D character.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I led anyone who has watched this show before knows we freaking love tables. Like, it's one of my favorite things to just sit and work on. I sat on stream one day and we just made tables for like a section of a map that we were building. Like, what is it going to be? I don't know. What are the ideas? All right, cool. Let's just pick one. Oh my gosh, that's so clever.
It's so much fun. And that randomization is just it makes
that's great
such
for one
shots. Yeah, 100%. Or for more than one shots, because it'll get you out of, we all have our habits we fall into. I almost always will play a magic user. I love playing elves. These are just my habits.
Yeah.
And sometimes I need something to kick my own butt and go, no, you're going to play something completely different this time. And there's no reason you can't include age on that table. There's no reason you can't put disability on that table. There's no reason you can't put background on that table.
Yeah.
Like, there's so much else you can put into that, other than just kind of, here are generic things.
So
You know,
okay, you
pick
know what?
things that are contradictory.
That's a challenge that I want to give to anyone who's watching. Just come up with a little chart of character traits. You can post it. You can keep it. Just come up with a little chart of character traits that make them different or interesting, or it makes them alive. Because character traits don't have to define who the character is. They just add to who the character is.
Yeah. And also, like, you can think about when these things happened to people.
That's huge.
And not everything had to happen. Like, some things just are, and some things develop, and some things are events. You know, there's so many different options there and permutations.
Oh, I've got ideas. I'm excited. Oh my gosh. So, question. What can you tell us about your adventure in Candlekeep that's not off limits by NDA Gen LL?
Okay, what can I tell you? So I can say that my adventure deals with some mysterious organ transplants. I can say that we get to go to Tashaluta. I can say that it's really fun.
I believe that one.
I can say that designing my map nearly destroyed me. I had the hardest time designing my map, but also that I discovered something about myself as I was doing it, which is that I have terrible visual spatial processing, and I knew that going in. And I ended up, as I was designing my dungeon, ended up needing to have a 3D representation to crack how I was going to design this thing, and ended up pulling out a laundry rack that I have and printing out labels for each of the rooms of my dungeon and attaching them to objects that were roughly of the scale of the rooms that they were involved in, putting them on the rack and then tying them together with string to represent the hallways. And it straight up was like the It's Always Sunny meme. Yeah, complete with me having the wild hair and just having my eyes wide because I hadn't slept because I was very nervous about this project. And then right at the very end, I discovered that I can draw isometric maps. I can't do top-down mapping, but isometric maps, when I can see in 3D what I'm doing, where I can go, oh, well, this is on this floor, and this is on this floor, and this connects here. I don't have to worry about the fact that this passageway from the same level connects to this level, but a different one on the same level connects to a different level, which I struggled with top-down.
Yeah.
On isometric, I could go, oh, that's done, easy. So I don't know if that helps anyone else out there who struggles with top-down mapping or visual spatial stuff, but hopefully you can avoid the issues I have, but either making a 3D model and or swapping over to isometric mapping may be of value.
Yeah. Well, Jen,
that's kind of, I think, all I can safely say about my adventure.
Hey, honestly, that's more than I expected, and I think that you might have sold a couple more people.
Yay.
Jen, tell us where we can find you on the internet.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter as DreamWispGen. You can find me on Twitch as... I'm sorry, you can find me on Twitter as DreamWisp. You can find me on Twitch as DreamWispGen. You can find me on Linktree as DreamWisp. That has all of my links. The accessibility in gaming resource is in my pinned tweet on Twitter. And then I'm around doing stuff.
Yeah.
More stuff being announced very soon.
Oh my gosh, Jen never stops. Thank you so much for joining me, Jen. This was so much fun, so freaking awesome. I've been like wanting to sit down and like talk with specifically just you and stream it for so long. And when I was like, wait, Jen, are you busy Friday? Awesome, let's do a thing. It was It was awesome. There was so much stuff that even just I myself learned, and I could see other people learning, and you definitely helped all of us become better storytellers. So that
Thank
is
you
huge.
so much. I'm so happy I got to sit down with you. This was so much fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much everybody for hanging out with us.
Yeah.
This was great.
So all of you have a wonderful rest of your day. Hydrate. Do whatever you need to do today. Allow yourself to just exist. You are chaotically creative, and I cannot wait to see what all of you do next. And I'll see you next time.